Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to our Artists in Conversation program with Mackenzie Cooley and René Treviño, being held in conjunction with our current exhibition, René Treviño, Stab of Guilt, which will be on view here at the Wellen until June 9. We're going to start this evening with some thank yous. Of course, thank you to all of you for being here at the museum. Thank you to our Zoom audience who is tuning in. We are going to have time for some questions at the end. So be thinking about those as we go along, or if you are on Zoom, feel free to put those in the chat as we progress throughout the program. A very, very, very big thank you to the Wellen team. It is, you can clap for him. Yeah, that's good. Amy, Shania, Dick, Laura, Liz, Marjorie, and all of the docents who tour our shows, who conceived of the Wellen Works education space, Chris Harrison and your entire team of installers, art handlers, preparators who built this exhibition with their bare hands, to Mike Jeffrey and the entire safety team who are wonderful and keep everything safe in the gallery. And of course, to our fearless leader, Tracy Adler. It is really my honor to be the one from our team representing all of your hard work up here today. So thank you to all of my colleagues at the Wellen. And thank you to our two guests today, René Treviño and Mackenzie Cooley. Just some quick intros. René Treviño was born in Kingsville, Texas, and grew up for his more formative years in South Texas. Eventually went to A&M University, Texas A&M University, to pursue an undergrad degree in theater. From there, moved to New York City and ended up working in costume shops in Broadway, and originally thinking maybe you were going to be a fashion designer, and were pursuing that, and then eventually figured out you wanted to be a painter, and went to the School of Visual Arts to pursue that undergraduate degree in painting. And then found your way to Baltimore for a master's degree there at Maryland Institute College of Art, which is now one of two institutions that you are a professor at, MICA and also Towson University. And we are so excited that we get to host your very first museum survey. And then we also have Mackenzie Cooley joining us. Mackenzie is a historian, and her big focus in terms of her research is looking at the uses, the abuses, and understandings of our natural world in early modern science and medicine. I was going to introduce her originally as one of our assistant professors, but because of an email that came out to campus from our president, David Whitman, today, I'm going to introduce you as a tenured professor here at Hamilton College. And also doing such amazing work as the chair of our Latin American Studies department. So thank you both for being here. I have some questions to kind of help prompt and guide our conversation tonight. And of course, this exhibition is about so many things. It's about astronomy and religion. It's about history, Mesoamerican history in particular, queer theory. We are going to address most of that in the talk tonight. But I wanted to start with the issue of identity and ask you, when you look around at this exhibition and about 15 years worth of work, what are the ways that you think the work that you're making complicates our notion of what the Latino experience is in the United States? How does your lived experience, your perspective, complicate some of these notions of, again, what we think maybe more traditionally the Latino experience in the United States is?
Sure. Thank you for having me, everyone. I'm so happy to be here, and I feel a little bit overwhelmed, but mostly happy to be here. All right. Well, it's crazy being here. This is my first museum survey. So this is, like Alexander said, 15 years of work. So when I look around the room and I sort of see work from different points in my life all come together, it's I don't know, it's a crazy experience, a humbling experience. It feels really moving, and I'm super thankful for it. You know, I've always operated in the world as kind of a hyphenate, right? Being gay, being Mexican, being American, being all of those things. So to sort of answer the question, I don't know that I can answer that question about being Latino at large. I know that I feel very connected to that part of myself. I also feel sometimes like a tourist in that space. But I was thinking about like what it means to be a tourist, like never feeling fully at home anywhere. But I do think that there's a great thing about being a tourist. Like you're always traveling, you're always learning, you're inquisitive. And so I think those positive sides of feeling like a tourist do outweigh that sort of longing for belonging and home. Although I do find it. So like, like any tourist, like when you travel, you find your people, you find your truth. And so I see that when I look around the room and when I think about all the things that will come after this too.
Mackenzie, it was so great when I first brought René to campus about 3 years ago, and we just sat down for coffee with you in your office. And it was definitely one of those moments for me where you introduce like 2 people at the party and then they headed off. And then I'm like, I should probably just leave now. You guys are, no, and so you have been such a resource for us over the course of these 3 years, helping guide parts of the exhibition, working with René, giving him more research interest to look at. And then it culminated this week with this wonderful class, this Intro to Latin American Studies class that you run, and René was able to visit your course. So first of all, I just want you to describe how you are approaching the discipline of Latin American Studies in this course with your students, but then talk about, because I think this helps illustrate our focus as a teaching museum. What is the value of bringing in a contemporary artist to the classroom to help talk to your students?
Well, so when René came into my office all those years ago, and of course we were starting to have conversations in high COVID, so it kind of felt like we would never get to see physical things ever again. But so
right, that first meeting was on Zoom.
It's true, and in some ways that made it very possible to see the ways in which your work is filled with the life of the mind, right? You take us on journeys into corals and into other planets, and of course into the deep past. But I think that your work brings out this something that I think is so important in Latin American studies, which is that it's not just about geopolitics. It's not just about violence. It's not just about questions of progress or lack thereof. In many ways, that's the wrong way to think about Latin America. Instead, it's a space to understand polyphony, right? A multitude of languages spoken, not just Spanish, but also Portuguese and also French, but also obviously Nahuatl, right? And all of the other variants of indigenous languages that are so vibrant throughout the Americas. And I think that attention to science and its overlaps with art and the sense of intellectual play, while also being happy to be a tourist, traveling through time and space, really made your work so intelligible to me, but also I think intelligible to us as a campus, as we were really trying to overhaul our Latin American Studies program. So Latin American Studies here has been on the books for about 40 years, and that's a really wonderful thing. And there have been fantastic courses taught across a whole variety of disciplines. Hispanic Studies is really where to go to get to read in Spanish about Latin America. But those of us who teach in English have been falling short. We too often emphasize a pretty monodimensional vision of Latin America. And we were undertaking this external review of the program. And the more I thought about the program, the more I thought about the vibrancy in your work and how we could bring those 2 things together. So today was just really the culmination of so many threads, because I have these amazing students in this Latin American Studies class, History 105, and they have come to this area of study for all sorts of different reasons. Sometimes because they're coming from places that speak Spanish. Sometimes they identify as Latino or Latina or Latinx. And sometimes because they didn't learn enough about Latin America in their high schools, and they see this chasm in what they know and what they want to know. And we've built the class to kind of culminate in your exhibition, while also feeding into all of the really wonderful energy that other colleagues across campus bring to the study of Latin America. Marissa Ambio, our fabulous US Latino specialist, and of course, Alex Badue, who's brought us this wonderful attention to Latin American music. So thank you so much for letting us celebrate with you and seeing all the growth and play and joy that come together in experiencing, even as tourists, this region.
Oh my God, thank you. That's so much. I appreciate it. And it's felt very much from the beginning, we've been working on this exhibit for 3 years. And the whole time I felt really welcome here. And, like we were in conversation and like we're in collaboration. And that's incredibly moving. And this is the culmination of that, but in a glorious celebratory kind of way. Yeah.
And it was an interesting moment even during that class session where, you were saying some of these things that the students are talking about in terms of finding this chasm and needing to fill in the gaps or whatever, that even though you grew up right next to Mexico, could just walk across the bridge in Mexico, that you didn't receive enough of that education growing up. And so you now, as an artist researcher, are embarking upon filling in those gaps as well.
Absolutely. And, I think there's, that thing about how I was taught art history, in a very specific way, in a very Western kind of way. And the thing is, like, I loved that, so it's not like I'm coming at it from a place of like, I'm angry that I learned the things that I learned. I'm actually really psyched that I learned those things. But you do recognize, it's like with anything, the more you learn, the more you know that you don't know, right? And so once you learn those things, you're like, hey, that's great, that's happening. I love learning those things about what's happening in this part of the world, what's happening elsewhere, what's happening with my ancestors, what's happening with my past. And yeah, it's been really exciting to embark upon learning and filling in those gaps. And hopefully that's what the work is doing too.
Yeah, I want to keep on this vein of the part of your practice that is so research intensive, because when we look around the gallery and notice the different materials, I think back to all these conversations that we've had over the last 3 years where you're so excited that, some material you ordered is coming in. I know you're really excited for this cochineal paint that's coming your way soon, which was traditionally a dye during the Mexica and Maya empires that was made out of the cochineal beetles. And now we find in carmine red, and amazing, you've taught me all of that. But when you look around the gallery, you see animal hides, you see semi-precious stones, you see feather work. What is it about the descriptions of, the depictions of the ancient Mesoamericans drives your work? Like, why use those materials now in the 21st century?
Oh my God, I find inspiration in materials. Materials are probably at the forefront of my practice. So I'm always, of course, looking to the past for what materials they were using, because that can offer incredible inspiration. But I'm also very much, an artist in 2024. And I'm thinking about what materials do I have access to? I'm thinking about, we live in a really global world, for better or for worse right now. And it's been great when amassing these materials that, sometimes it's about a trip to New York. Sometimes it's about this like massive collection of objects that I have in my basement that I've been collecting for years and years and years. Sometimes it's about ordering something from India or from Turkey, or from like when I travel to Mexico, being able to pick up different things there and bringing them all together. Like materials, I'm so interested in that. Like, I can really nerd out with you about paint, about the surface of all of the work. It's really why a lot of the work in the gallery does two things. It moves. When you walk past it, it has a little bit of movement. The feathers, the shimmer wall, the fringe, and a lot of the leather works. It has that kind of movement. It was also why I was never interested in framing all of the work in the exhibit, because I want you to see that surface. But that goes back to that relationship to materials. And yes, I'm very interested in like Maya blue or cochineal red, or those things that they were using when they made their codices, when they made their objects, some of those skulls that are decorated with turquoise and jade and obsidian. Like those things are so beautiful. And so of course I want to bring that to the work. Like I'm inspired by it. I can still get my hands on some of those things. So I want to bring it to the work, but I also want to bring in, a little bit of Las Vegas.
Are you gonna get the actual bugs? Are you gonna do some swishing in order to get this cochineal? No, okay, these are process questions.
Maybe the future. Who knows what the future will bring? But at this point, it's someone else has dealt with the bugs, and I'm just getting.
Fair enough. But you can bring bugs out in other ways. No, but there's some really wonderful new projects in history and in Indigenous studies that are working on cochineal farming, right?
Yeah.
On the ability to identify male versus female insects. For a long time, the Spaniards had no idea what they were looking at. They didn't even know that this was a bug, right? And so the story of cochineal is really about hidden Indigenous knowledges that were so held so precious throughout the pre-colonial period and kind of mutilated in one way or another by the Spanish, but who still prized the red.
And yeah, and it's crazy to look at the codices and to look at various images and to think that some of those reds have really stayed that beautiful red. Some of those blues have stayed that really beautiful blue. You think, and they had it. They understood the science of making pigments, and they were really utilizing their environment to make those things. And I find endless inspiration in that.
Be grounding up the bugs in the future.
Well, next time you come to Baltimore, we'll do it together.
Fair enough. You know what to bring.
So staying with this issue of materiality, for someone like you, Mackenzie, that is a historian and is trying to tell these very grand narratives, I want to ask you about the ways in which I've seen you do this. One of our art historians on faculty, Laura Tillery, does this really well, where in order to tackle this huge stretch of time, this huge grand narrative or whatever, there's actually still a utility in, maybe even a power in focusing on a singular object, whether it's a work of art or an artifact, and analyzing it through its materiality in order to tell not just something about the artistic world of the Mexica or the Maya, but even the social world, the political world of ancient Mesoamerica. How have you found ways to again focus in on sort of the granular, the individual object, the materiality, to actually help explain something much larger?
Absolutely. So much of the best work in history right now, in history of science, and even in intellectual history, has been focused on itineraries, how objects move across time and space, and how they acquire new meanings along the way. So that's really exciting because up to maybe 25 years ago, most scholars contributing to those literatures were really focused on treatises, on books, on these big printed tomes. And that means they missed out on a lot. They could focus on authorship, but they missed objects moving across time and space. But if we learn nothing else from the moment of encounter between the Europeans and Indigenous Americans, and of course Africans, that we call the Columbian Exchange, we know that objects matter, right? It matters that the tomato made its way to Europe and totally transformed the wonderful world of pizza that we enjoy today, right? In Italian cuisine. But so too did Mesoamerican objects, right? So there have been great itinerary histories that focus on things like tobacco, right? So you'd smoke with a ruler. It would be a way of signaling power. Likewise, chocolate, always, which was a Mesoamerican good, always symbolized some form of blood. And people would drink liquid chocolate together as a way of, in some ways, participating in this soft version of a sacrifice and seeing what flows themselves and imagining who had been laid bare in the center of the temple, which was a really important way of connecting present life with ancestor, right? So rather than just seeing chocolate as a commodity, we can see that history, which is filled with what we call different ontologies, different worldviews that change across time and space. So we can take seriously that chocolate is still, in one way or another, sweet or not blood. But in the work that we have here, I think we see a lot of these objects that tend to move the feather work is front and center among those types of materials. Very early on in the Spanish Overseas Empire, the featherwork of the Nawa was absolutely prized. It was glistening, it was gorgeous. It's what they dressed their rulers in, and what Europeans wanted to dress in too.
Yep.
And powerful because of that sheen, that wonderful iridescence.
That wonderful iridescence, and hopefully you see, I loved learning about this iridescence from Mackenzie, but hopefully you see that throughout the exhibit and all the different materials that I'm using, from the metallic leather to the metallic paints, also all the rhinestones to the shimmer wall, and then those feathers too. I mean, there's something about them that's just, I mean, this is my first project where I utilized feathers, and so it's been such a learning curve to learn about them, to learn how expensive they are, because they're, I just hadn't made that. I hadn't made that association with cost, but of course they're expensive. It makes sense that they're expensive, but there's nothing better. And you're right, they do have that beautiful sheen and iridescence and majesty, because the birds have majesty, so they have majesty. No, but yeah, that materiality and that surface and that iridescence, I'm always interested in that. It's again, back to materials and back to sparkle.
Yeah, well, the Nawas thought about their whole kind of taxonomy, their whole vision of nature. They had tonali was at the center of it, right? This idea of soul, which came from energy that was received from the sun and was mimicked in everything that had life. But birds could be better birds and worse birds, not based on how large they were, how many of them there were, or how good they were to eat, but instead on how beautiful their feathers were, right? Whether they were elite or somehow seen as inferior. And I would say you have some really excellent birds that are incorporated into the show.
It's a collaboration, not a willing collaboration, sadly.
And do you just want to mention specifically what type of feathers you're
I'm using all kinds of feathers. It's been so interesting. We started this whole project during the pandemic when traveling was harder, but also like the garment district is not the same as the garment district was when I left New York. Everything was more centralized in New York before I left. And now, because of the price of real estate and just the way everything works, like it's much more spread out. And every time I go to New York, I'm trying to do a million things, not just shop for materials. So sometimes I was able to like literally touch the feather and then buy the feather. But a lot of times I was ordering things online, and I really am. I mean, talk about bringing Vegas to the Welland. But some of these are the same feathers that would be in a showgirl's, feathers, right? Which is really exciting. It's a whole world. But there's the really long striped spectacular ones. Those are pheasant feathers. The shorter, kind of the ones that have a little bit of iridescence that are shorter, but also take up a lot of volume. Those are rooster feathers. And there's a lot of other different kinds of feathers in there as well, but those are the primary ones that I was able to use. It was also a learning. These are my first headdresses. And so one of the things that I did a lot was, I would go to Mexico, go to the Zocalo, and I would watch those performers when they were setting up for the day. And, they're like, that's their livelihood. But like also parking in the Zocalo is impossible. So they literally have to take the feathers out, take, their headdress, like all of that just has to come apart, get thrown in a backpack at the end of the day and get remade the next day. And so I was really watching them and taking pictures and, asking them questions, trying to figure out the way that these headdresses were made. And it's been so fun to create my own versions of those things.
So are these collapsible or?
Yeah.
Are they?
They came here to the museum. Like the band is like it's a round band and that's fixed, but there's slots for all the feathers. And literally they had me in the basement. I call it the basement sweatshop.
It's got to be a better way to describe that.
I don't know that there is. That might be the perfect way to describe it. And I was making the headdresses while they were making a stop action video of my, which is great. No, and it was so great because I had kind of seen them. I had proof of concept in my studio, but when I was here actually making them, that's when I was really finishing the work. So that was so exciting to be in the basement, I'm joking. The basement was actually lovely. I always had good company. I always had support. But but it was fantastic to see them come together in that way. Again, you know, like I thought it would work. I had some basic proof of concept from my studio, but they didn't actually get finished until I was putting them together here.
One of the things I love to talk about is the incredible array of resources that we get to provide to our artists. So it's not just, you know, purely the honoraria or whatever, but it's being able to bring you to campus and, you know, take you to facilities like the Peters Observatory and hang out with Adam Lark and look through the telescope and talk about astronomy, or to put you in touch with Mackenzie and really have you be able to explore new and overlapping research interests with her. And so it's interesting to me because I always kind of designate you two as like, oh, well, you're a historian and you're an artist. But especially in doing the class visits this week, what has really become clear to me is that even though those can be very distinct professions, it actually starts from a very similar place, which is a place of asking, a place of questioning. And in the case of both of you, questioning of history. Yep. Why do we believe these certain things about history? What factors have led to those beliefs, and how do those beliefs even still affect us in our contemporary lives? What are those ripple effects that last until 2024? So I want to start off by asking you, René, how you view your role as an artist who's engaging with history and not just retelling history, but creating new retellings of history, altering history, asking some pretty big questions about history that might, you know, bring up fundamental changes in what we think, especially about, you know, the ancient Mesoamericans. How do you view your role as sort of a researcher, artist, historian?
Well, I'm infinitely inspired. You know, I'm infinitely inspired by the work of historians. But I am so fortunate, I think, to be able to approach it as an artist as opposed to a historian. Historians have to have all those footnotes, all that research, all that documentation, justify their you know, their theses, you know, all of that. And that's I mean, it's just amazing. I mean, reading Mackenzie's books, I mean, just like the amount of research and resources that you put into the books are just, it's amazing, but also overwhelming. And it's like that thing I mentioned before. It's like the more you know, like you learn something from Mackenzie's book, but then you realize, wait, but that brings up this question, that brings up this question, that brings up this question. And it's kind of in those questions where I feel like I function, right? To kind of like fill in some gaps, and to kind of, you know, we've had several conversations this week. I mean, it's 2024, it's on everyone's mind about misinformation, especially with the advent of AI. And I'm used to misinformation, right? I bask in misinformation, not because I'm psyched about it, but just because you know, I made a series in grad school called the Propaganda Series because I was becoming acutely aware of how you could use images in any way you want to construct whatever kind of narrative you want, whether that's truth or whether that's false. And so that kind of duality or that kind of ambiguous space in between what's truth and what's not truth is where I think my art fits, where what I'm thinking about comes to light. I'm also very aware that history, you know, some people are incredibly rigorous with their research, but you have to always be, you always have to look at who's telling you the history, who's recanting that history, who's researching that, because a lot of times historians have perspectives and points of view and life experience that colors the way that they retell history. And so I always think about how complicated that is, and it kind of gives me a headache even just talking about it because it's so much. But yeah, I think, you know, if I can't fix that, that's a big thing to try to fix, but I can add some complexity and I can ask even more questions, and I can translate things the way I want them to be translated, and I can add queerness where I'm not seeing evidence of queerness. I can do that in my art in a way that a historian would have a harder time doing.
But it can also prompt historical questions too, right? I'm thinking about your representation of queer sexualities in the past, right? There's great new research coming out every day on the ways in which, especially in Mesoamerica, there were many different ways to be a sexual being in the world, right? Gender was something the body. People sometimes had greater mobility to choose what they wanted to do sexually when they were younger, and people took that into consideration. And of course, you always had the power of a shamanic voyage made possible by something like embodying the jaguar, which you could do by accessing a mask, not unlike what we have on the first wonderful piece among the regalia. So what I love about being in this teaching museum and being here with students who are also going to go on to pursue research projects in this field, it's that an idea, all of your pieces are filled with theses yet to be tested and explored, and whether they are real in the historical record or not, they provoke us. And I think that that's something that we as scholars need to listen to, regardless of what our relationship to factual creation ought to be.
I love that.
One of the historical moments that you do spend a lot of time thinking about in this exhibition is the moment of the conquest. Cortez coming into what is now Mexico and eventually overthrowing Montezuma II and the dissolution soon thereafter of the Aztec or Mexica Empire. It's something that you see right away when you enter the exhibition. You see these three beautiful capes and headdresses, and they are this wonderful mix of the Mexica style headdress, but then these European courtly robes. And you're thinking about, okay, well, what if history was different? What if these two societies had actually joined together? Maybe this is what their wardrobes would have looked like. There's a lot of ways that you contemplate this, but I actually want to throw this to you, Mackenzie, to just help us understand what was that encounter like? What maybe do we not think about or talk about or focus on enough in terms of the overtures that were made between the two groups and of course, eventually the violent conquest, one over the other. But what do we need to know about that historical moment?
Well, as René says, it's tricky, right? Our means of access, the story of when Moctezuma met Cortez, are mediated through a set of highly biased, very particular documents, right? We have the records of the conquistadors who were part of the voyage and reflecting back, but we also have some indigenous texts, like the Nahuatl or glyph-based version of the Florentine Codex, which record what it was like to remember the conquest through Nahua eyes. And one of the things that you see in the images there is this initial interest in trading gifts with the Europeans, right? In finding ways of perhaps creating kinship, perhaps even dressing up Cortez to look whether like the god Huitzilopochtli, or whether like another deity, or just in regalia that would be appropriate for diplomatic relations of the time. But from there, views really split, right? It's unsure who knew what. Did Cortez intend to take over everything? Did Moctezuma feel a sense of premonition, of fear, of awareness of what would happen? Some scholars have posited that he was already traumatized when the reports started coming to him, knowing that Cortez would ultimately take the empire because the soothsayers had told him so. And I think that we're still doing a lot of work to unearth the right interpretation to that story, and even the right word. Is it an encounter? Is it a collision? Or is it a conquest? And it probably is all of those things. But those terms are equally true in different moments.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about, not understanding that impulse to go to someplace and like it and want it to be yours. Like, I just don't understand that impulse, right? But, you know, I'm living in a different time, under a different system of beliefs. So, you know, it's not necessarily mine to understand, except that, you know, I'm thinking about that story the way that I was taught that story in 7th grade in my Spanish class, and not a very nuanced a retelling of that story. And you know, I always like wanted to, you know, I always want to like align myself with the underdog, or I like believe in the underdog, and like I want them to come out on top. And so like I always wanted Montezuma to like be the victor in this encounter or conquest. But the truth is that Montezuma was also a monster. You know, like he, in order to sort of have amassed as much wealth and a territory as he amassed, you know, he was really brutal about warfare and conquering the peoples that were around his empire. And so he was kind of ruling with fear too. And like that's, so then it's like, then there's no hero in the story, right? Or the heroes are not the ones that you necessarily think are heroes. Maybe the heroes are someone like the Malinche character, who, you know, had a very difficult life and, you know, ended up working with the Spanish. But, you know, she was really just trying to preserve herself, because she had very few choices. Or you find heroes in other moments, but I mean, that instinct to find a hero when you're reading history or when you're reading a book or when you're reading any of those things, like that's just part of the human existence. The problem is that a hero to one person, well, it's a villain to someone else. And I think that dichotomy is, you know, so palpable. And in this story, you know, making these capes, I was kind of trying to reimagine a future or a past, depending on how you look at it. And what would happen if I could somehow imbue those characters that were involved in that conquest with the powers of premonition, foresight, and intuition? If you have those powers, if you're bestowed with those powers and you have the ability to foresee, how do you act differently? Like, what could the world be? And it's a thought experiment, and it's only a thought experiment, sadly, but I keep thinking about that and like a different way to navigate, you know, encounters, when we're still very much living in a colonialist world, right?
When did Stab of Guilt come in as the title?
Well, I mean, guilt is such a powerful tool or emotion, and it can, you know, it can promote change, right? So that stab of guilt, I mean, I'm thinking about the way that we've really destroyed this planet, or we're destroying it, actively still destroying it. I'm thinking about like humanity. I'm such an optimist. I really am an optimist on the one hand, but I also think humanity is garbage. Like both of those things can be true at the same time. I'm also thinking about, like, this is my first museum survey. And so I'm thinking about like museums in general. I think museums are having to really reckon with their past. Where did their collections come from? What artists are they showing? Who do they serve? Who do they not serve? What artists do they show? Like, so there's like guilt associated, or hopefully there's guilt associated with that. But then, I mean, you know, like all this is happening and those are the serious answers. But there was this moment a few years ago when my mother, who lives in Texas and is watching tonight.
I was gonna say, you know, she's watching and she's gonna hear this story.
You'll hear the story. She said to me, because she lives in Texas and because I live in Baltimore and we don't get to see each other as often as we'd like, she said to me, I'm probably only going to see you 20 more times before I die. And I was like, you know, just like the guilt, right? The palpable guilt of that. So thinking about that, but you know what? Like again, guilt is a powerful emotion, and it actually was like, well, I can, like maybe that's like the gift of foresight, and I can say, well, maybe it'll be 25, maybe it'll be 30 more times, and we can make those 30 times really count. right? In a way that without that pronouncement, without that guilt trip, we might not have, right? So like, again, it's a really powerful emotion that we can use for transformation.
So before we open it up to questions, we went to some of the darker parts. I want to bring it back to the light now. And just kind of close with this idea of universality that is throughout your work.
Yeah.
And you know, you said it best, like, I'm an optimist, but I think humanity is garbage. There's no, you know, kumbaya moment in the exhibition necessarily, but there really is a positive outlook. And so when you think of some of these grids, you know, there's this beautiful one behind us, the circumference series there on the south wall. You're pulling these images, these sources from all different time periods, different cultures. Some of them are utilitarian objects rooted in industrial design. Some of them are quote unquote the priceless work of art. But you're doing all of this. You're taking the priceless work of art and putting it next to the sewer grate or the Oreo cookie or whatever, in a way to remind us of our shared humanity, that at the end of the day, we are more similar than we are different. And I think we've had a lot of really productive and intense conversations, even in the last 3 days, about the fact that we are living in a polarized country. We are living in an increasingly polarized world. And, you know, so I find such satisfaction out of working with an artist such as yourself that is still thinking about what kind of images can I put out there? What kind of bodies of work can I put out there that do just help remind us a little bit at the end of the day that we're more similar than different? How do you approach that as a strategy in your work?
I think probably the first circle that I ever painted was the Aztec or the Mexica calendar stone. And you know, I went to my first trip to Mexico City. I went to the Anthropology Museum and I saw the real calendar stone in real life. And it's like one of those symbols that's everywhere. It's on bumper stickers, it's on t-shirts. And so I think I thought I knew what it was going to be, but in fact, when I saw it, it was such an experience. I describe it as a punch in the gut. And so I started painting it, trying to get at that same feeling, trying to get you guys or the audience at large to sort of see that same thing, to experience that same punch in the gut. And, you know, probably never getting there, but thinking that the pursuit of that is really lofty. But once I started painting that circle, well, then you start to see circles everywhere. And so I kept seeing them and I kept thinking, you know, and, you know, some of them are industrial design, like there's a disco ball, there's, like you mentioned, the sewer grate, but some of them, you know, are priceless antiquities, you know, things that are in museums that are revered. But there's also, sometimes I'm painting from the real object, sometimes I'm painting from the souvenir of an object. And I love souvenirs, you know, as a tourist, right, of the world. I like to bring back something that can help me remember my trip, my visit. And yeah, so I just think about all these circular things that I've been painting and then stepping back, making these giant grids, thinking about that we're all on this big sphere. We're surrounded by all these other spheres. And I really do think if we really think about it, we are more the same than we are different. And when I talk about being both an optimist and a pessimist, truthfully, the optimism wins out. And I do want the experience for all of you guys to be one of celebration. It's one of the reasons that, you know, the color is so, you know, I really think about color and the exuberance of color, but it's also why we've got the disco wall, why we've got the papel picado, which is another indication of celebration. You see papel picado at weddings and baptisms and joyful events, also at Mexican food restaurants. But yeah, I want the work to be a celebration, and I do want us to think about our shared humanity.
Awesome. My fearless colleague, Amy Sylvester, has volunteered to bring a microphone around. So if you have a question, I would love for you to just wait for Amy to get to you, because we want even the people on Zoom to hear it.
Hi. So I'm also a queer Latino person, and those things don't always go very nicely together. Modern Hispanic Latino communities can be very bigoted, and with kind of like historical ancestor thing, there are like with indigenous communities, there are some that are more open, like the Muhe people of Oaxaca, but there's also histories where like I've read a little bit like apparently Aztec people not cool with gay people. Um, so how do you personally and with your artwork kind of reconcile that queerness with the modern culture and also history and ancestry and all of that?
Thank you for that question. I do grapple with that. When I talk about feeling like a tourist, I mean, sometimes that even is feeling like a tourist within my own family. I think about growing up and the women sort of all in the kitchen and the men sort of watching football and drinking beer in the back, and me like not knowing, like not feeling like either of those things. And so not knowing where to go or how to occupy my time during those, what we're supposed to feel like celebratory, like um, moments when family was coming together. So I think about that. I think also about I imagine that along with the Spanish conquest came this like interesting, but also problematic set of morals and morality that was different than what was there before. So you've got Catholicism kind of coming, and all the morality and the weird politics around morality, around gender, that came from that, from that. And I think about that all of the time. And again, sort of just another thing, another layer on this thing that sort of made me feel like, where is home? Where is that? And I do want that in the work. Like that's sort of like, I want the work to be unabashedly queer. It's why it sparkles. It's why I use color the way that I use it. But part of that, like it took me a long time to get there. That didn't happen overnight. But now it's here and I'm not going back.
Mackenzie,
thoughts on
where is some of you started to mention we're getting more research about queerness in ancient Mesoamerica. What are some of these things that are starting to come out?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of attention to what it means to be young and beautiful, right? We have good descriptions of aesthetic that we can start to tease out of ethnographic sources and art historical sources. So you would get things like the wonders of having really tomato-esque skin, right? And what that type of beauty looks like. But you're entirely right with your question that, in many spaces, especially in courtly settings, what we would see is blatant homosexuality was not always championed by empires that were interested, of course, in controlling reproduction and controlling access to bodies that would then inherit in one way or another control of a territory. So the picture is not rosy, but nor is it meant to be quite so black and white as we who are living this legacy of the rise of European empires have come to see sexuality, right? And so there's great work about sodomy and homosocial love within the colonial Mexico. Zeb Tortorici, who was here a couple of years ago, did this amazing project on falling in love with a man in a colonial space. And that happened all the time. And people find a way, right? Love finds a way.
Okay.
Thank you so much. This is amazing work. I was thinking as you were speaking about Montezuma, about the fact that the Spanish had indigenous allies in conquering the Mexicas, the Tlaxcala and then Zempoala, again, serving to show this duality of history. I also think about how impactful Vasconcelos is in creating the idea of mestizaje as the status quo in Mexico, and how in doing so erases many of the indigenous communities that make up the history of what is current day Mexico. For example, thinking about the Tarahumara and Yaqui in northern Mexico, are these things that come up in your research, and how do you question the fact that Vasconcelos' work led to this idolatry of the Mexica in Mexico?
What a beautiful, complicated question. No, it absolutely is part of my research. I'm still very much learning about things, about processes. It's been so great being able to, exchange ideas with all my historian friends, including Mackenzie now. And so I'm still very much learning about it. But no, it's baked into the work. And it's definitely something that I'm thinking of. And this term mestizo, mestije. I love that word, right? Because it kind of it's not European, it's not only indigenous, it's this mix of those things. And it's a problematic thing too, maybe, but it's how I feel, it's how I can feel connected to these things at the same time that I've had, all the privilege of being American, first of all. And it's a complicated idea. Yeah.
Becomes a way to really erase the condition.
Mhm.
And even the white people further serve to like elevate the white community that's very, very so like the word that we go is more complicated than that. Like I would think about all these beautiful things, but it's just further complicated how to think about
Yeah, I think that there are, look, it's really hard to be indigenous in Mexico right now, right? And in many ways, indigenous communities who have, regardless of their personal inheritance, who have not taken part in this vision of themselves as part of the population that is mestizo, miss out on a lot of things that come along with Mexican nationhood. So things that one can do about it and things that one can kind of access are language revitalization projects, spaces that carve out opportunities for people to preserve speaking the language they want to speak in their own communities and gain recognition from the state while still maintaining that difference and being able to mark that on the census if that's what they want, right? And so, I mean, I think that it's both of those things, right? On one hand, mestizaje has a complicated history. It's an animal term originally, right? It refers to questions of mixing that cross human and animal boundaries, as many, many, many of the race categories that were used in colonial Latin America are. But it also provides this opportunity for different things to recombine in a novel way. Has it been used in some ways to paint a monochromatic image of what it means to be a part of the Mexican population? Sure, but it can also be used as a space for that resuscitation when used, attentively and effectively with the widespread attention to indigenous communities.
I know we've got a couple more down here, Amy. Let's go blue shirt and then black shirt.
Hi. Again, I saw you on, we talked on Monday, and my question was, I see a very strong, your work has a very diverse, it has a ton of different inspirations and sources, and that is very, very evident, but also it is very evident the Mexican influences. It's a very, very strong Mexican work. However, for many people who are not as familiar, you will inevitably end up representing an entire continent. And I would just like to know if your work is the only thing anyone will be familiar with from South America, what would you like them to take away from it? And also, how does it feel that, to know that you may be the only representation of that people may get? I'm sure I could have worded that better, but my apologies.
No, that's so interesting. First of all, I was talking about the way that we teach art history in general and the way I was taught art history. And, that was a pretty narrow focus there. And so one of the things, again, loving having learned the art history that I learned, but realizing what I didn't learn right away and wanting to open up that area, that field of knowledge. And so then I had to do that work of opening up and finding and seeking out artists that were doing that work. And I mean, I think now you have to do that work, right? Where you have to now, hopefully being inspired by what you see today. But I mean, there's so many Latinx artists that are making really important work in the world. And now, I can talk later and I can give you some names, but so many artists that are doing really amazing things. So I can't wear the burden of that. That's impossible. But I think what it brought up for you was that I think you're hungry for more of that, right? So now, realizing, one of the things in Mackenzie's class today, when folks were talking about why they took that class, why they're studying that, it was because they didn't have enough of that in high school. They didn't have enough of that. Even if they were growing up Latino, they didn't have enough of that information because it's hard, to I don't speak Spanish as well as I could. My family didn't speak Spanish to me, and they made a conscious choice not to speak Spanish to me because it was the thing that would kind of create a separation and would potentially could keep me from reaching certain milestones of being American. So to fit in more, exactly. So now and now you can research, because that's certainly not on my shoulders. There's a lot of people doing this work and a lot of really amazing people doing this work. And now you know what you don't know, and now you can find the answers.
And I just will add on to that, because we had a really great conversation today with the Women's and Gender Studies class, and I'm not sure if that student is here that raised this point, but there's the different disciplines that you're thinking about, and there's these different intersectionalities that you're thinking about, and so you are putting that into the work, but you are also unabashedly making sure that René Treviño is in the work, that this is still very much your perspective, and that you're actually trying to make sure I'm not speaking for anyone else in this work except for my own lived experience. And you just said it before in the talk, it took you a while to get there, to figure out how to do that, but that you are very clear about that in the work.
Absolutely.
All right, right here.
Hi.
Hello.
My name is Ida. Okay, so earlier in the talk, you spoke a lot about movement, and I'm looking around. Your pieces are very vibrant and they're very loud. I would like to say in the best way possible. So they're very loud. So something that I'm curious about is your artistic process. Do you listen to any like music? Do you work in a silent space? Do you have people constantly around? Like, what is it like working in a space where you create these vibrant pieces? I'm just very curious about that, especially the música. I want to know.
Thank you for asking. In terms of music, I go through such journeys, and a lot of times I'll go through really deep dives, like with a specific artist. So I would say several of the paintings behind me were me doing a really deep dive into Joan Baez. I just love her voice. It's so like clean and magical. I also really love Linda Ronstadt, and Linda Ronstadt, again, sort of a lot of this was made while listening to Linda Ronstadt, not only some of her like greatest hits, but she also made a couple of really beautiful Mexican music albums, and they're just fantastic. She's got one of those voices too that's like super clean, and she can hit all those like really high notes, but also can have a lot of gravel in her voice. So she's hitting lots of literal notes when she's singing, but I think listening to that kind of music like helps me when I'm making my marks also kind of hit different kinds of notes. But my studio is in my home. I live in Baltimore. We have an old 1890s Victorian brownstone, and it's a big old house. I have the whole second floor as my studio, and I have 4 cats that are able to come in and out as they please, and they're like my studio my unofficial studio assistants. I live there with my husband. I love working at home. I've tried having studios outside of home, but I love working at home because I can always be there. I can be working till 3, 4 in the morning, which I often do. I can be doing a load of laundry. It's no big deal for me to go downstairs and make a sandwich. You know, I can like live my life with the art too, which feels really important. So there's not that distinction between like my artist self and my real self. They can be more more aligned. They're the same, really, right? Yeah, but that's a great question. But I mean, those are not the only things that I listen to, but those are things that I was listening to while I made this work behind me, for sure.
What about your relationship with Megan Thee Stallion? The Celestial Body, yada, yada.
Well, no, because the title of this piece is called Celestial Body, Yada Yadis. And you know, Megan Thee Stallion is it, right? I don't. No, I love Doja Cat too. No, I love her. There's something about her. I don't think, I think she is just like listening to her lyrics. They're catchy, they're poppy, but they can cut, right? She's like just her form. She's like endlessly inspirational, that power that she holds. And so when I was thinking about how I was going to title this piece, you know, I was kind of thinking of celestial bodies. There's a lot of planets, there's a lot of moons up here. But Celestial Bodies was such a boring title. And then, you know, you hear that song and it's so catchy, body, yada, yada, yada. And I was like, no, I can't. Yes, I can. Yes, I can. And like one of my favorite stories is that, you know, then when I came up with the title, I got to email Alexander the video. And I was like, watch this. This is where the title comes from. And so his work as a curator at his desk upstairs.
Just immediately shutting the laptop, like, nope. Nope.
No, but it's fantastic. And no, she's such a, just, you know, she's everything to me.
Amy, do we have anything that has come in online that you would like to pose to René?
Yes, we have a question from Jack. In a more personal context, during your upbringing within your family, how was the narrative shaped around Mexican cultural heritage and the influence of the Spaniards? To what extent did this narrative impact your interest in exploring these historical and cultural intersections?
You know what? It's like every day, right? It's in every aspect of life. You know, my father's from Laredo, and so we would spend a lot of time in Laredo. And at that time, when I was young, that border was so easy. It was, you know, wide open. You pay a dime and you could cross and spend the day in Nuevo Laredo, go to the mercado. I think a lot of my color sensibility comes from those mercados and all the beautiful things that the artisans were making, and that even at that young age, I was trying to collect. I think it's there. I think, you know, of funny family dynamics. You know, a lot of it was centered around church. We went to church every Sunday. The difference between the church in Laredo, Texas versus the church in Edroy, Texas, where my mother is, versus where we lived in Lake Jackson, Texas, like it's all Catholicism, but like the aesthetics of it, there's similarities, but there's also a lot of distinctions. I was also very much thinking about, you know, this is a whole different conversation, but it seems maybe tied up in the question about colorism and, you know, the darkness or the lightness of people's skin. You know, how, you know, literally, I think how much you were mixed with indigenous populations. And that was dictated by you know, that could be told by the color of your skin. And that was an effect, you know, like, yeah, I mean, just like the politics of that was always present. So it's always present. It's always present. It's always there.
We are about at time, but if there is one more question that anyone would like to ask René.
Something joyful. Let's end on something joyful.
Yeah, I'm sorry. My question is not joke. So thank you so much for exhibition. It's amazing. But I also wanted to ask this. So history of post-contact America is full of colonization, trauma, and guilt. And as a person traveling and working through all of these layers of good and complex emotion, how do you cope with that? How do you take care of yourself when you're producing the art and feeling these emotions? Because myself coming from colonized community, it is very hard to work with emotions occurring when producing such art. And it would be amazing to hear your experience and how you deal with it.
I think it's through the art. I mean, I think literally it's through the making, right? The work is really durational and takes a long time to make. And sitting with that, I'm thinking about a million things. My mind is going a mile a minute. I'm always thinking, always processing, always trying to figure stuff out. But I'm also like, because that's my happy place. That's my place of joy. Even if the work that I'm making is thinking about or talking about things that are complicated or have darkness, it's through the making of it that I heal. But I mean, that's how I do it. And I think everyone has to find their own way. But I think there's nothing better than the power of making something, the power of making something go from just an idea in your head to being something actualized. I think that's the way that I process and heal.
And we're gonna end with one question, Amy, from online.
Yes, this is a semi-joyful question from Patricia. After such an amazing retrospective, what's next? Evolution of this work or something that explores something entirely different that speaks to another part of your story?
Yeah, God, this was such a great opportunity for me. I feel so fortunate to have had this opportunity. I also am one of those people that, like, when I'm busy, when I have the most to do, that's when I have the most ideas for the next thing to do. And so as I've been making this work, of course, I have all these ideas now for new work. These capes, these are the first capes that I've ever made. These are the first headdresses I've ever made. They will not be the last headdresses and the last capes that I make. There will be more, and they will be soon. Also travel, last year, my husband was supposed to come to Mexico with me, but his passport was expired, so he wasn't able to come. So this summer, we're going to make up for that. So travel, I have a number of group shows that are on the horizon. I also like these grids, the one behind us and the one to our left, are just the beginning. These grids, it was one of the things when I came into this space, how I thought I could contend with these super high ceilings and the vastness of this museum. I thought, well, the way that I can contend with that is with these grids. And these grids are not over. Right now, there's 119 over there. There's 21 behind us. And I can see myself working with some of these themes and ideas for a lot longer. So I can't wait. What I'm super excited about is that I get back to Baltimore on Saturday, and then it's my spring break too. So back to the studio, back to work. And thank you for that question. And thank you guys for everything.
René Treviño, Stab of Guilt. It's going to be on view till June 9. So we want you to come back, bring your friends. There is a beautiful catalog on the desk as you leave, designed by Tim Lown and Natalie Wedeking. That is free, does no good collecting dust in our basement. Please take one on the way out. And there's also a beautiful exhibition video by Brett Novak on our YouTube page. Please send that around and share René's work as much as possible. And thank you all for being here tonight.
Thank you.